Well, that was a real treat, I must say, a real treat. And as I say, isn't it wonderful that the descendants of people who come are actually building our culture, building our literature? It's just to me, it's mind-boggling. Okay, an interesting aspect of the coordination of the sponsorship movement at the community level was the fact that the people from the churches and the different levels of government and different organizations all got involved. And the next panel, it was put together to give us some examples of how this in fact happened at the community and local levels. Our chair is quite an old friend of mine now, as I think back of it, first one so young. Our chair is Dr. Shauna Labman, an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. Her research areas include immigration and refugee law, human rights, citizenship, international law, and jurisprudence. She focuses on the layered influences of law on public policy and government position. Dr. Labman's doctoral project at UBC examined the intersection of international rights, responsibility, and obligations in the absence of a legal scheme for refugee resettlement. Shauna, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you for having us follow Vincent Lam. No pressure at all on this panel. So the official title of this panel is Recruiting, Matching, and Supporting Refugees. I think the unofficial title that Mike sort of led into yesterday when he mentioned that the refugee liaison officers were troubleshooters is that these were the troubleshooters in various different ways. Well, Hulene could be a troubleshooter. Bob, you sort of described yourself as someone who put out fires, and John, you described yourself as the spark. So these are the wonderful people surrounding me, and before I ask them questions, we had a pre-panel last night after dinner while I sipped a glass of wine, and I realized that I don't even have much role as a chair because my role was to ask questions, and they last night, as we talked for way over the time we're allotted today, asked each other enough questions to keep this conversation going. So I have some questions that I'll throw out and see how they answer, and then we'll open it up to everyone else to ask questions as well. Just a little bit of a highlight without giving biographies, because all their biographies were there. As you heard in a panel this morning, John was one of the MCC people involved in forming the very first master agreement for sponsorship holders. Bob Parks is one of those government guys who showed up on Howard Edelman's doorstep and asked to be in a meeting he wasn't invited to. And Hulene was telling me a story yesterday from Kitchener-Waterloo calling UNHCR's office in Geneva to ask for support to do education in the schools and getting books from them. And she did it to Geneva because she didn't know there was an office in Ottawa. So these are the type of people that we are working with today. So my first question, and because John's role with the MCC had him going overseas and back, Bob worked for the government and Hulene was on the regional, local level in Kitchener-Waterloo. We're going to sort of go from the broad overseas to the government, to the local, and sort of our order of questions here. So John, starting with you, do you want to talk a little bit about what drove your agency and what drove the MCC to become involved in the Indochinese sponsorship?
Well, our agency has been involved with international situations for many years, starting off in the Ukraine, actually, in 1920 or 22, 21, in that time. So it was a natural for us to keep our eyes open. Of course, I wasn't around in the early days, but my grandmother was. My grandmother went through a very traumatic period. Some of this has been alluded to. During the famine and the revolution, the chaos, she not only lost her husband, but also that family, which was called Bergman. They lost the grandfather, who was the Mennonites' first representative to the Russian Duma. He never said very much because it was far too late in the game, but he was assassinated or shot. All his sons-in-law, there wasn't a male that came to Canada or left the country that was over 18 years old. They were all younger that left. The older ones were gone. So my grandmother tells me that had it not been for the intervention of what she said, the brothers in America, which meant Canada and the U.S., who sent aid, She doesn't know how she would have survived with 6 kids, moving or being forced to move from one place to another to another. And so that's the background that so many of our people experienced in the very early days. And subsequently, through the various periods, again and again, MCC responded to emergency situations. So when this arose, this situation, it was just a plain natural that we would have to look at it. Mennonite Central Committee, as you heard from Bill, was involved in Vietnam. And as we heard, that war was played out in every living room of our constituency. The TV carried plenty of images, much earlier, but also during the time of the Exodus. So, so happened that my particular position had changed over the years. I came there to MCC Canada when it was very early, in the early days, soon after the formation of MCC Canada, which became a separate entity from our international group, which was headquartered in the U.S. side. And you can imagine what that means. During the time when the U.S. was involved, Canada was not involved. We were neutral, or we thought we were, and the U.S. Was at war. So when I first came to MCC, I was in one role as Associate Executive Secretary, which sounds great, except there were only 2 of us, and one was the Executive Secretary and the other one was the Associate. It soon grew, though, I should say, by the 1987 or 88, there was a massive change in our program as well as in our activities. So by that time, I was coordinator or director of overseas services for MCC Canada, which was separate from the U.S. side of things. And during that time, of course, we became quite involved with what was going on. There were volunteers in Vietnam who then exited, not immediately. They stayed on in Vietnam in 1975 when the war was suddenly over, but then they eventually had to leave. And so we had some people in Thailand, and we were confident, of course, that MCC workers keep their eyes open, only to find out that some of them had actually closed their eyes. They didn't like the idea of these refugees coming. And here we were basically caught a little bit, only to learn that there were a lot of people in camps. So one of how we became involved was that I was on a trip first to Vietnam, where we talked to the government in 1978, I believe it was, and asked them, why are you allowing this to happen? Well, we were not all that informed. You know, we thought maybe these people are leaving for personal reasons or whatever, not quite understanding the great push, although we knew of it. We knew it, but we didn't know it. So we said, it's not good for you people to push these people out or to allow them to go. Your reputation is much more valuable than that. But they said, if they want to go, let them go. But we were friends to the Vietnamese. We were not enemies. We had sent an aid, as Bill said. One of my colleagues and I were doing this aid from Europe, this medical aid that he referred to, very quietly, smuggling equipment from the German border through the Russian zone into to the East zone, and to demonstrate that we were not enemies. We were friends. We didn't like what was going on, but we wanted to make very clear. I think in a sense it paid off in the long run. But that's how we got involved. And so from there, in 78, I went over to Thailand and saw the camps. The story I heard, and I hadn't checked with the government of Canada regarding figures, but the stories I heard locally there, about 500,000 people in camps, not only in Thailand, of course. But what was very evident was that the Cambodian people that were coming across the border were creating a lot of pressure on the government, or the government was creating pressure on them. There were threats of them being sent back. The guerrillas were coming over the borders from Cambodia into the camps. There was a lot of tension. And the message we very clearly got, get them out of here. Well, we heard there were some people going to France, some people going to Germany, a few people here and a few people there. America was taking some. But basically, 500,000, where are they going to go? And that was one of the big concerns that we brought back to MCC Canada.
Great start. We'll hear more from John in a little bit. Bob, you were let's get your proper title here, Program Specialist, Settlement Branch, Canada Employment and Immigration Commission. So it was sort of your job. Indeed. But beyond that, how was the government messaging here from your perspective as a sort of government player on the ground involved in the Indochinese?
Well, I think I'd like to start with some thoughts that came out from listening to Mike Malloy talk about the history and of the legislation and so on. Am I okay? A little closer? All right. As I say, some thoughts that came up as I listened to Mike Malloy yesterday talk about the history of the legislation. I started as an immigration officer at Toronto International Airport in 1972. By 1978, I'd actually won a position as an immigration adjudicator under the 1976 Act. I think to hear you describe the 1951 Act as something that was about control struck a chord with me. Because I think very much in my early years in immigration, we had two groups. We used to call them the hawks and the doves. I was probably a dove, I'm sure I was. And so to get the job in settlement for me was like a dream come true, actually. My experience under the new legislation as an adjudicator disappointed me. I thought it was going to be different because the setup of the hearing was different. But really, in the end, what it came down to is that based upon the evidence, I hereby order you deported. And I didn't like ordering people deported. So to get a job in settlement was great. How I got the job in a settlement was a bit of a surprise to me, really, because my involvement and understanding of refugees, when I think about it, came down to a couple of things. One day in 1973, I went to work in the morning. They handed me the UN definition of a convention refugee and said, we had some people come in from Chile last night. Go do an examination under oath with a view to seeing whether or not these people met the criteria. And the other thing when I think about it is after we made the deportation order, we always said, is there any reason why you shouldn't be removed from Canada? And that was supposed to be the key to give people the idea about, well, yeah, there is, but most didn't. So I applied for the job in settlement, and I got it. I was very pleased. When I think back, I think either Andre Pilon really liked something he saw in me, or he needed another guy for the regional office baseball team. When I got to settlement in 1978, the main programs we had were the Adjustment Assistance Program, which is a financial assistance to government-assisted refugees, and funding for community agencies, the Immigrant Settlement and Adaptation Program. The Adjustment Assistance Program, Naomi reminded me of the term we used, is that we provided functional guidance out to the field. We didn't have people directly reporting to us, so it was functional guidance. And one of the things that was interesting about that, again going back to Mike was saying, is that we were all under one department. But Naomi and I were talking about how each individual directorate kind of had its own culture. We were in immigration. The adjustment assistance program was delivered by the employment centers out there. And that was an interesting kind of dynamic whenever we tried to send messages out and the bureaucracy we had to go through. Anyway, one of the other programs that ended up in settlement in the Ontario region was the sponsorship program. And when I got there, they had developed a presentation on the sponsorship program that talked about the history of the Canadian refugee response, the creation of designated classes under the new legislation, and the group sponsorship program. We began with training for the local CIC staff throughout the region in 1978. I don't really recall a whole lot of doing public presentations during the fall of 1978. And last night, I came across a handout in the book that talked about the designated class being brought into effect in December 1978. Earlier in 1978, who were you going to sponsor? You had to be a convention refugee. We didn't have designated classes yet. Later on in the fall of 78, there was the Hai Hong incident. And Andre decided he wanted someone from the Ontario region to be present at Long Point when the flights arrived. So he sent me. There were 4 flights that landed over the period of time there. My role was kind of a liaison and troubleshooter on behalf of the Ontario region. I didn't speak French. We had 2 CEC counselors from Hawkesbury who did. They did a great job. One of the other interesting elements was the presence of a staff person from OHIP with an interpreter, because the provincial government had decided to give these folks immediate health coverage. Another dynamic that I think about there were the Quebec immigration staff, who I must say I found to be very accommodating to my non-French capability. 2 things I really remember about the Hai Hong event. It was decided that the last group leaving Long Point for Toronto should travel by train rather than by plane. And as we pulled into Toronto, I could hear kind of I think they put us in a separate car. As we pulled into Toronto, I could hear kind of a murmur going on in the car on one side of the train. There was an elderly man on the other side of the train that was looking out the window, kind of perplexed. So I turned to the north side of the train and looked out the window, and you could see the lights of the Toronto skyline. So I tapped the elderly man on the shoulder and brought him over so he could look out the window. The smile on his face was amazing. The other thing I remember about Long Point is the officer in charge. I can't remember his name. He was, I think, a retired Foreign Service officer. And I think apropos of what we've seen here yesterday, those Foreign Service officers can tell a good story, especially if it's at the officer's mess at the end of the day. Shall I carry on?
Do you want to take a break and then we'll come back to it?
Okay, sure.
Okay. I promise we'll come back. So Helene, you were working as a refugee liaison officer in Kitchener-Waterloo. And my understanding is in Kitchener-Waterloo, it was a little distinct how you operated. So if you could just talk to us a bit about that.
So I want to answer sort of your first question about why we got involved from, and the why being 2 things. Number 1 is the why, the employment development branch, which was this rather unique branch within Canada Employment and Immigration, became involved. And Naomi, you will speak to that tomorrow. But let me just give you a little bit about who we were. So this is an organization that, in my memory, originally started in Secretary of State shortly after Company of Young Canadians ended. This was a time where we had youth unemployment. Trudeau wanted to understand more about youth, and the government hired a number of young people who were community organizers to go and work in a whole variety of communities to help them identify needs, look at their strengths, and basically come up with innovative solutions to complex problems. I had enormous experience at 23 to do this. I was in charge of, at that time, working in Windsor, Ontario, and I believe I had a budget of $3 million. We had incredible organizational capacity. How I ended up there was that I had been part of a women's liberation movement. I read in the paper that they were having a meeting about women's liberation, and I was really frustrated that we had male jobs and female jobs. So I wanted that changed. So I went to the meeting, and within about 2 years, the women in the group, we were at that point, I think 9, 7 had started, we decided we didn't know enough about how to change government. So everybody got together and said, okay, Patsy, you should do this, and we need to write something about how to influence municipal affairs, and we need to change OHIP. It wasn't called OHIP then, it was something else. And we need to really address workers' compensation. And Huline, we understand the government's putting out lots of money, and you are going to go and we're going to help you get this job that somebody knew is going to come up soon. And I said, well, you know, I have a young child. I don't think I'm going to do that. No, you need to go into government. So that's basically, so I filled out the application. And frankly, I think the person who hired me, David Harvey, already had decided before meeting me that I was going to be one of the people coming in. My story wasn't unique. So that's a bit of who we were. Shortly before this, the whole department of what had been called Opportunities for Youth moved to Employment and Immigration. And it's called Manpower and Immigration. How could I forget? So another quality of the structural nature of this department is we had self-directing teams, peer group teams. So we didn't, in fact, have a hierarchy. And we also had very vast relations with different departments and different people within society. So you know, Lois Wilson of the United Church used to say that the 3 wise men were not those 3 men who came from the East. They were anybody who crossed borders. And we used to say, we crossed borders. So when our department moved to Manpower and Immigration, some of us saw it as a closing down of our social activism. Most of us did move. We were committed to saying, how could we be involved? And at some point along the way, the refugee liaison officer position came up, and I believe many of the people who then were assigned that role came out of the Employment Development Branch. So what did Employment Development Branch do? Is there any lasting legacy to give you a sense of why that particular department, Mike, you said that you had one minister, you had all we needed. We had Foreign Service, we had immigration, we had settlement, and you had employment development who knew how to make change. So a couple of things. Community legal centers started under that branch, funded it. Community health centers, Parkdale, came at that time. Community economic development initiatives came. Lots of innovation was happening, and our role was not only to fund it, it was actually to sit down with the community and work together and figure out how it could go forward. So it seems to me that that was a good asset that we had in responding to this crisis. I'm going to switch now and say, why Kitchener-Waterloo? So by 1977, I was in Kitchener-Waterloo, and I think 78 or 79, I'm not very good on the dates as other people seem to be, but I was working as the refugee liaison officer. Kitchener-Waterloo was a mid-sized community of 200,000 people. We had a vibrant, diverse economy. We had manufacturing, rich agricultural land. There was lots of social innovation happening in Kitchener-Waterloo. Project Plowshares had just begun. The victim offender restorative justice program had just been launched. There was worker education centers. Lots of social action was happening. And we had received a number of refugees in terms of the proportion of our community. So we had Hungarians and Czechs. Most importantly, we had Ugandans, we had Chileans. Many of us were involved in the anti-apartheid movement at that time in that community. And we had a little center called Global Community Center that worked in churches, in schools, and with the general public, funded in part by Mennonite Central Committee. And we had the Provincial Office of Mennonite Central Committee, who had signed the first master agreement, but within whom the culture and the history and the reality of being refugees was very much alive. But that culture was also part of our community culture. Many of us knew refugees, even if we ourselves had not been refugees. It was a community small enough that we didn't have the capacity to have silos. So the same group of people who might work on this area, even if they only agreed on these 3 principles, would still work together, even if they would be working against each other on 2 other topics. So it knew how to cooperate, that community. And I think that made it very, very open to receiving what I was told at one time was more Indochinese refugees per capita than any other census area. It also was unique in that Mennonite Central Committee was willing to undertake a hosting role for the refugee liaison officer. Frankly, I didn't want to be reporting to government, to this new ministry that had, as Bob pointed out, a number of hawks. So I went to Ray Schlegel and MCC and I said, look, let's get together everybody who's working on the Indochinese movement. And let's form a coordinating committee. And right now I have functional authority. I have to report into Naomi. I can call Martha Nixon. I can call Mike Malloy. I can do that. But I have to get my manager on side because he probably really wants me to do something very different than what we need, because we need to do a community development approach to resettle the kind of people we want to bring in. And Ray said, as Ray is wont to do, aha, okay, so what would this mean? And together, we pulled together about 8 people. Secretary of State, Project Lifeline, it came a little later with Sue Coulter. We had someone from Sri Lanka who was in the process of working with immigrant women. Lorna Van Mossel, who right now is I just received news from my husband, is in the hospital, not doing well at all, but who set up the friendship families. A whole group of people from the churches, the school board, local government, the hospital, and we just pulled together a committee. And the local employment center agreed that since I already was reporting to 2 bosses anyway, a third didn't matter. So they agreed that my functional authority would also be to the coordinating committee. And we as a coordinating committee agreed all of the planning and analysis would happen at the committee level, and then we would come up with a community-based solution.
Okay, so with that introduction, I'm now going to bring into the narrative everything we're doing. If you have been paying attention on the conference as a whole, these organizers did a very good job of showing you all the different wheels. And so yesterday we started with the refugee stories of becoming refugees, and then we've seen the government, and now, finally, what happened when the refugees started to arrive in Canada in terms of coordinating with the communities and the sponsors?
You know, just before coming here to this conference, I tinkered with a little gimmick, and I took it apart. I like to do that. And it had it was a mechanism that prevented slippage in a ratchet type of machine. Well, enough said about that, but what struck me was there's one big wheel, and then there's another little wheel in there, and there are a few brakes in there, and then a little gear in there, and so on. And when I listened to what was going on here yesterday, particularly, I thought, boy, we were just such a little gear in that whole works. We thought we were doing it, and all these guys up in Ottawa had been struggling with this, preparing the groundwork and all that, and here, you know, somehow we just plugged in there and we didn't grind the gears. They just seemed to work. Very impressive, I must say. All right, what happened? Bill already alluded to this. When I came back, we had a number of conferences or meetings, and certainly a big board conference. We had input from knowledgeable people from Vietnam, and the board was unanimous in saying we've got to do something. That was the operative word, do something. We didn't know exactly how to do it, but that was it. And Bill reminded me just yesterday that when we started thinking about how we should do it, Bill came over to Winnipeg and we sat down, and from our point of view, or our organizational point, we started drafting what we thought might work in settlement. That was not final, that was just a working paper, actually. But we checked and we rechecked, and then afterwards there were a number of phone calls back and forth. So the process of agreeing to what might work was worked out, and then taken to Ottawa, where Bill, together with his buddies there in immigration, worked out the details, which were finally signed. From our headquarters point of view, I should say it was relatively simple. The way we're structured makes it easy. And I think it's something that we should remind ourselves that there are a lot of ways of doing this without having to reinvent a lot of wheels, really. One of them is, okay, we signed the master agreement, and then we sloughed it off to the local, the provincial groups. You know, there's MCC BC, MCC Alberta, MCC Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and beyond. The beyond regions came to Winnipeg, but those 5 ones. Okay, now we've done our work here. We appointed one person to oversee the total thing, and then we passed it on back down the track. Well, the provincial groups did exactly the same thing. They went to the churches, explained things, and then the churches had to decide, are they going to respond or not? And there was, of course, a lot more than that. We sent out publicity, we did our work, but the sensitizing was really done, I think, by the media to the greatest extent. And it just took off. So the arrangements financially were very clear. We would take the responsibility as far as the federal government is concerned, nationally. And the provincial groups would take responsibility for whatever happened locally. But they passed that off. And so the churches came up with the money, they came up with the problem solving. The provincial groups all appointed, I think every one of them appointed at least one coordinator and helpers. And those were really the people that were on the front line. I remember being invited to a number of other groups, not the Mennonites, to explain this new product called the sponsorship agreement. And it worked, you know. It worked. I was invited to one church, and I developed a very simple formula to get them to move. And this was a rather large church in Winnipeg, a Mennonite church. And they had agreed to go ahead with it, but they weren't moving. So they invited me to come down there and tell them how to do it, or advise them, or whatever nice words you use. So I said, I have a formula worked out. First of all, have to be committed to doing it. Okay, you want to do it? Good. Secondly, you organize. You can't do it in a vacuum. You have to have your little committee, your structure, you find out who's doing the housing, et cetera, et cetera. The third one, very important, act. Get at it. Do it. That was it. And you know, the churches really responded.
Fantastic, thank you. Bob?
All right, well, coming into 1979 then, we now had the designated classes. The sponsorship program had been set up initially in Ontario anyway, where we had a process. A local application had to be made at our local Canada Immigration Centre. At the Immigration Centre, they did their assessment of the application, attached the application to a covering memo, which they sent to us at regional headquarters for review. We approved the sponsorship based on some criteria we had, which I have no memory of now. And once approved, it's interesting though, I don't think there was a national standard for those criteria. But anyway, we approved the sponsorship, sent the information back to the CIC so the sponsors could be notified. And we sent the info to national headquarters so that they could record the information for future use in the matching process. I was surprised to see the establishment of the master agreement so early in the program when I look back on the history. Because that was, I believe, February or March 1979. Because from my view in the bureaucracy, that reduced a great deal of red tape for us. The master agreement signers had to take the responsibility for ensuring that the sponsors would uphold their part of the agreement. So that was interesting to see. And we've heard a bit about how MCC dealt with it. I'm not sure how bureaucratic some of the churches might have been in their processes before they issued that letter authorizing people to sign their agreements. It's too bad Nancy Nichols couldn't make it. She was a representative from the Catholic Diocese of Toronto. One of the interesting things for me during that time was getting to know a lot of people in different church organizations and getting a sense of the way different church organizations operated. Certainly the Catholic Church, what we had to do is set up agreements with each individual diocese or archdiocese. There wasn't the capacity to do one across the region or across the country. And one, I do remember actually going out and talking with a group of priests in London, Ontario, for example, when we were talking about the agreement with them. I also recall being there when I think the final agreement was signed with the United Church of Canada. So that was part of the sponsorship program. In the report that was put together by the Commission on the sponsorship program, and I can't remember if it was in the package or not, but I saw it. Up until December 30th, 1980, there were 7,675 sponsorships made across Canada. 3,203 of them were in Ontario. And you may recall yesterday that Naomi said we had all that information on index cards. Because the next process was the matching process as things got going. We heard yesterday the comments from the visa officers and how they said it wasn't Sears catalog and how I said we called it, it's not Eaton's catalog. Naomi talked about hearing some of the staff and the sales job they did over the phone with local CICs and local CECs as we were assigning families. Yesterday I had a former colleague with me, Albert Lee. He was the main guy in our matching center. And not so much, I guess, on the sponsorship side, but with the government-assisted refugees, what we found out when we went out into the local offices, Albert was a salesman. Everybody knew Albert. And he got the job done. But then there was that whole thing about, so you got a match, you had to convey that information back to Ottawa. Ottawa had to get it to the visa office. I'm not sure, once we got the staging areas going, whether then the information went to the staging area. Then so you had a match. The sponsor finally, this was a comment Howard had made to me, is that a problem that sponsors experienced was that time lag between making the application and the refugees actually coming. Anyway, we went through that process, notification of arrival, and the sponsors had their refugees. I think what I'm finding now, I couldn't remember about this, but what I'm finding now is that they're certainly for the government-assisted refugees, there was an employment counselor there when they arrived at their destination. I'm not quite sure that it worked 100% that way with the sponsored refugees. Certainly the sponsors were there, but I gather that there wasn't always an immigration officer there, although we certainly from the regional office would have hoped that there was. One of the other elements of the sponsorship program is there was a monitoring process set up. And I think it was probably 6 months in a year that we sent out a request to the local office to follow up on that sponsorship and report back to us on how they were doing. I really don't recall many major problems with the sponsorship program. The minor program was a different story, but the sponsorship program, I don't really remember a lot of problems, and I think there were two elements that helped that out. RLOs locally was one, and the other one was the master agreement. The signatories solved the problem. I want to mention something that Albert's wife said to me when I picked him up yesterday to bring him over here. Her comment was, our phone was on 24-hour call. Albert set it up so that if there was any problem along the way, give him a call. And that's the kind of things people did. In terms of the promotion of sponsorship, as I said, until they went to designated classes, what really was there to promote too much? Once things got going, the media coverage, I mean, that's another piece of the puzzle, getting people interested and so on. I don't think we were calling people up, asking them if they'd like us to come out and talk about sponsorship. But at a point in time, we started getting those calls. And obviously, we got a call to go to Wells Avenue on a Sunday afternoon. Howard's surprised that we showed up on a Sunday afternoon. Well, for me, it wasn't a surprise. That's what we did. And when it was mentioned that it was a Sunday afternoon, to me, in my recollection, my reaction is, Sunday, second day of rest, double time. Another aspect that I never really made a connection on until yesterday was the talk about Project 4000 in Ottawa and the mayor's involvement. I remember that Andre and I took a trip to Windsor to meet with the mayor and some committee there about sponsorship. And then one day we got a call. They wanted someone to come and meet with the Mississauga Council. When I got there, I found out, in fact, I was on the agenda for a council meeting and was the equivalent of making a deputation on the sponsorship program. There was a lot of discussion then, and I'm sitting there. And, later on, I worked for Metro Toronto and City of Toronto and got a better insight to what happened at the municipal level, but it's the first time I'd ever been to a council meeting. So they had a long discussion. My recollection was that they deferred a decision. When it's all over, and I'm getting ready to go, Hazel McCallion comes over and says, "You did a good job, young man." For some reason, I think we must have gone out once the Operation Lifeline thing came. I think we went out more often. I don't know how often. As I drive around Toronto, I look at a church or a synagogue, and I'm thinking, did I go there? One that really sticks out in my mind for some reason is Ellesmere and Markham in Toronto. I remember going there. I think one of the other elements I would say about that time, though, and maybe we'll get into that later on, for me, in settlement at that time, it was a time of building relationships. Building relationships within the department, with other levels of government, with the community and community agencies and that kind of thing. And maybe we can talk more about that later. But it was just a very interesting time in terms of that. And the people I got to know, and some of whom I still talk to. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. I'll just add that yesterday Bob told me he only had a few minutes worth of things to say. So, Helene.
In terms of the sponsorships, at the coordinating committee, MCC agreed to work along with some other people and to take the primary responsibility for doing education around sponsorships. Because we had so many who were willing to and wanting to respond, we decided to do the sort of train the trainer program. And we set up 4 major workshops. And then basically, I don't remember very much after those major workshops that we did in terms of my own involvement. Where I would get involved is if there were complex situations where we needed to, for some reason, intervene with the level of government. If we need, dental care was a huge issue because it wasn't covered. So, until we could identify a couple of dentists willing to do things, that was an issue. We had some issues around documents and schools, but we had people from the school board on our committee, and we worked that out. But that would be the level that I would get involved, and really the churches almost looked after that on their own. And by that, I'm MCC, but the Christian Reformed Church, the Catholics, the Lutherans who have an office in KW, Nancy Kelly played a very big role, Lorna Van Mossel with the Presbyterians. There was a decision made at this coordinating committee that it was Lorna Van Mossel who brought it forward, which she identified that while we had government-sponsored refugees who came with money, and we had a very good worker in a woman, Betty Weber, who was dedicated and committed and did everything. She met every plane and helped people organize. We did know from research that what people need is a friend. So yes, you need housing and you need food and all those, but if you have one friend who can help you navigate the system and understand that community, that's critical. And so we set up something called Friendship Families, and we made a decision that whether you came as private sponsors or whether you came as government sponsors, or if you came under the Joint Assistance Program, that we had a value that all of those people should have the same kind of support, both financial as well as human support. And so that became a principle that we worked hard. So often some of the training that was done for sponsorships was the same training that was done for people who were involved in the government support programs. I want to say something about the Joint Assistance Program. Because of largely MCC had made a decision locally with some other people, particularly the Chileans, a couple, Maria Alvarez, I'll use her name, who went on to spend a lifetime doing settlement work in our community, who had come with a child who had a disability, as well as some other people in the community who were quite committed that our community had the capacity to welcome, receive, and settle people who had complex problems. So MCC agreed that we would take on First of all, the resettlement of the Hmong community. That was a more challenging community because they had larger families, often polygamous. They were not literate in their own language. They had suffered, their journey to get into the camps was long. Often they had been for a long time in the camps. So we devised a separate program of resettlement for them. We also agreed to take on a couple of families who had very significant health problems, and that's probably one of the areas where I became more involved. Let me say a couple words about the Hmong resettlement program, because I think, and Max Brem is here, who actually has more of a memory about this some days than I do, but we decided that what we would do is try to identify sponsors who would be willing to continue to work with the other sponsors together, as well as with the individual family that came. So we would do this as a group, and we were really assisted in this by having, quite by chance, a young woman who herself was Hmong, and in the community, Blia, who we've since lost track of. But we did a lot of training to prepare the sponsors for when the Hmong families would arrive. We continued to do sessions where we would bring together the sponsors and the Hmong refugees to have sessions where they would meet separately to identify what are the issues. We'd come back and use the community mediation services we had in our community to talk about what was happening. So we had people who were very skilled at that, and then to do some problem solving. And then we would carry on. We did a second thing, which was to say, language problems. We had identified that language was critical in terms of the resettlement. We actually had somebody go and do some research about what is the best way to learn language if you are not literate in your own language, in your native language. And here the school board, Shirley Lose, was remarkable in really advocating at the school board that we needed extra and different kind of language learning, and similar at the college level. So we had problems like that, but we also had solutions, that we had people who had knowledge, and we had capacity to raise money. One of the things the coordinating committee had decided is we wanted a 100% chance to get every grant we asked for. We had about 5 of us who were fairly good at doing grant making and had done it. No grant application for the community went to any funder that didn't go first and was vetted through the committee. We decided who had priority. I think we got every grant we had asked for. And we didn't spend a lot of time writing these applications. It was sort of, we'd go and say, this is what we need, here's who we have behind us. So we had the resources to do some of those things. The last thing I want to talk about is with the Hmong refugees. Is we decided to look at the community who had arrived in terms of what were their skills. I mean, a number of us were very enamored with the work of John McKnight, focusing on assets as well as needs. So we actually mapped who were the leaders in the community for different things. So, for example, if you were a woman and you had health problems, who were they going to at that time? If you were a man and you were dealing with issues of conflict in your family, who was the person that they went to? We identified those different people, and then we had a team of people. Deb Woods is the Canadian, and then Blia. And our goal was then to match those people who were already leaders in the community in those areas with people in the broader KW community, somebody in public health in the hospital, somebody in counseling when we were dealing with mental health, and to try and build the capacity of that community itself, and the capacity of the community at large in KW, which had to change in order to meet the needs, not just of the Hmong, but we saw this enormous opportunity. I mean, you had sponsors going to the school board saying, that program doesn't work, and here's why. And while, yes, we would often, because of the sponsor intervention, get the problem solved for X family, our goal was to say, how do we transform the school system so it works better for all immigrants? How do we transform counseling so it's appropriate for other newcomers who came? And so we had really strong advocates within many of those institutions.
Great. I gave my panel a whole list of questions, but I'm going to condense the end here so that we ensure some time for questions to each other and from the rest of you. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists for some final thoughts, if there's anything important from the period that they want to still get out, and also, because this is a panel of troubleshooters, if we are arguably in trouble today, what sort of things do you think have changed, and what should maybe be done differently today in terms of, from the MCC, from the government, from community development, in terms of what is different now and how could it be thought of differently?
Well, I just thought of, while we were listening here, I was thinking in Manitoba, for instance, a lot of things happened. The interfaith group established its own presence and contributed in its own way, aside of the different organizations which they did. So there was an awful lot of other activities that were combined. The province was quite interested, and so I can't list them all, and I don't even know them all, but there were. One thing I think that happened, well, I know that happened, was that at the church or the congregational level, there were usually a couple or a small group assigned to, or which would take responsibility for a sponsored family. And one of the things, I remember I have a friend who was a social worker, and one of the things he drilled was financial accountability, how to handle finances. And that was a real issue because some of the people really didn't know beans all. They were encounters. And I think that raised another question. We did run, from time to time, into problems with finances, with government-sponsored. They got money. Private sponsors very often didn't, especially if they came to Mennonite families. You know, the Mennonites were very frugal and conscientious about how they're going to spend money. First thing they tried to do is get them to work. I mean, that's how you earn your money. That's how our parents did it, etc. And, you know, there was a lot of good about it, but we missed a few also. We should have spent perhaps a little bit more time in training and so on. It's just a short reaction here.
Thank you. Bob?
Well, one of the things I want to mention, and it follows again what Mike was talking about the leadership by the senior government people in Ottawa. I think it's probably about the time of the announcement of the 50,000 or so, we had a meeting at the Ontario Regional Headquarters of staff. I think we brought as many as we could in from across the region. And one of the speakers was our executive director, a man by the name of Jack Boyd. Jack laid down the law. I remember him saying to people, we have been given our direction. If you don't like it, you should leave now. That's what he said to the collected staff that day, and that really struck me about get a clear message of what we're going to do here. So when Howard said, well, what about the National Coalition stuff? I kind of thought, yeah, what about that? It didn't really matter to us because it hadn't changed the direction we've been given in terms of what it is we had to carry out. I think a couple of things I like to mention about what I learned in those days. One, I think I learned from Howard Edelman. I have a recollection of us going to a meeting where there weren't as many people as I expected to show up. And Howard said afterwards, you work with who comes out. That was a powerful lesson for me. The other is something that actually came a little later, but I still remember is, your mother isn't here to look after you. I'm also want to say that I'm very glad to see that in later years, some of the staff that worked in the Ontario region was finally recognized, frontline staff that is. And particularly, I'd like to recognize Ralph Talbot and Deb Ashford. And I'd also just like to say how great it was to work for Naomi.
Well, I'll also echo that. I think that those of us who worked in that time, Naomi, you provided both moral leadership, support, as did people in the Ottawa policy. And it didn't matter that you were working at a community level. You were there to help. Equally important, our input was sought on policy making. And that was quite critical. One of the things that when I was going through some of my notes that I noticed and I was surprised about was a concern that we had at the coordinating committee about refugee dependency. We were worried that the sponsorship program could lead to dependency. And I've been trying to think about where that came from, and I think I recall it, though if I'll check with people in the community. And that was that some of the people who were already in Canada who'd been refugees from other countries talked about the resilience that you needed to escape and be a refugee. And I think it was Maria Alvarez said, you know, the people who are coming are survivors. These are the people who are innovators, they're going to make it, and while they need the sponsorship and help, you have to be really careful that you do it in a way that enables them to gain the skills to thrive and not just to provide direction. And I think that was that informed how we worked in Kitchener-Waterloo. I want to pay special tribute to two people, to Lau Vang, who we hired as the Hmong community worker, and he worked for MCC, and Tuan Law. And I want to tell two stories, one by each of them. Lau Vang was a very young man when he arrived as part of this community. And I remember sitting at our table with my husband and our daughter, and after a long night, just a sidebar, when I heard the foreign officers, when you were talking about your nights and how long you worked, at one point, our daughter, who at this point would have been probably 9, 10, it was at supper time, and I always tried to be home for supper. The phone rang, and she picked it up, and she said, "My mother is dead." And we just looked, and she said, "I think you need to have time to be a mother and just be home occasionally." We all were working crazy hours, probably not to the extent you were. Anyway, Lau, that led me to start inviting people home for supper. And Lau started to cry, and he asked my husband, and he said, "How did you know how to become a man?" And Michael has a very lovely presence and way of asking questions and talking. And he asked Lau, "Well, what are you asking? How can I help?" And Lau said, "In my country, I would have learned how to become a man at different stages as I aged. But I've lost all of my family. So I've only learned how to be a man up to the point I'm 21. And I will need people to help me learn how to become a good man as I age." I thought, what courage. And he did become a really fine man at different ages. The other person is Tuan Law, who we hired to be a Vietnamese community worker. Tuan had been studying in his final year of a medical doctor in Vietnam. He grew up in the context of terrible fear of communism. It was such a negative thing. And then he arrives in Kitchener-Waterloo, and the main coordinating committee people are many people who were refugees from Chile. You know, their experience was the CIA, killing their families. And that was a real tension that he held. One of the things we tried to do was public education about refugees in general. At this time, my memory is there were about 20 million refugees in the world at that time. The Horn of Africa was happening. There was lots going on in Central America. And we brought together 4 or 5 people and did a weekend retreat, and those people told their stories. So a Chilean told a story, a Sri Lankan, I can't remember, somebody from the Hmong community, the Vietnamese community, maybe someone else, and we all told the story. At the end of that session, Tuan, who had told the story before he was hired, turned to me and he said, despite what happens in each country, and despite your politics and your race, when you're a refugee, you share some of the same story. And I need to work and help Central American refugees, even though their politics are different. And he went on to become very involved in volunteering in the refugee movement and to maintain to this day a commitment of helping newcomers.
Well, I'd like to thank all my panelists for really interesting thoughts and reflections on a fascinating time where you gave all of your energy in a way that seems to exhaust me even thinking about it. I'm going to open it up for questions now, so please feel free to come to the mics, or if the panelists, I know last night you all had questions for each other, so feel free to continue to ask them as well.
That's pretty quiet, eh?
It's pretty quiet. You set it up well?
I have a comment.
Okay.
What this conference is doing to me is reminding me of the future, actually. And I'm asking myself, what are we going to do about the refugees that are sitting out there all over the world, all over? The answer is not to bring them all to Canada, obviously. Everybody would agree. So my first answer to myself is, well, let's keep on doing what we're doing, because there still are a lot of families to be unified, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not going to be the answer. So I would hope that we would very seriously struggle with the question of what do we do? Because we are going to be held accountable, I think, we should be, to our response to the world around us.
Well, I have a comment. I'm not so sure I want to make it after what my co-panelist has just said, but one of the thoughts that struck me when preparing for the conference was the time frame that was set out, 1975 to 1980. The Indochinese Refugee movement, for those of us in government, did not stop in 1980. And in fact, I don't think it had stopped by the time I left the federal government in 1987. And I was thinking about some of the words we started to use when we got a little further along in the 80s. Absorptive capacity, sponsorship, or compassion fatigue were the kinds of things that came up in the discussion. And I just thought I'd mention that. Because it would kind of, I think, relate to where we're at now. Is that willingness to support people out there? I don't really know. I've been retired for 8 years now, and I've tried to kind of make it a thing where I sort of live my own life at peace, thank you very much. So there we are.
Shauna, will you let me talk?
I will let you talk, Tom.
Okay.
What I find interesting, and I'm going to try to think of this humorously, but I've been doing this work for 35 years, and I'm still doing it. And one of the big changes that has happened is that when I began to sponsor refugees, you did it with a single sheet of paper, 2 sides of a single sheet of paper. You put the sponsor's information on one side, and you identify the refugee and his or her address on the back side. And then you shipped it off to immigration, and over a course of time, they did everything else, and eventually the refugee arrived. Today, we have to complete forms that are in total, I think it's 20 pages. 20 detailed pages. It's hard, hard work to complete those forms. And so we have totally bureaucratized a system that used to be so simple in the glory days that you've been portraying and that I well remember too.
Thank you, Tom. I'll say, even as a lawyer, I find the forms very, very complicated. So I'll agree there. Pastor.
I have listening to the thing that you have been done for so many years and continue to doing that. My concern now, the two things that I was involved lately, for about a year ago, the so-called a refugee claimant in Canada. Have you ever heard that? The people who come in here as a visitor, visitor, or the people who come in here as an agency worker. So those people that I had experience with, they jump ship. They come as agency worker, which is they are legally to come here and work. But when they realize that, I don't know where they get information from, and they jump ship. And then they can claim refugee. So they can stay here, or some people claim refugee in order to stay on to work. Because they come as an agency, some of agencies signing up for 1 year's work or for 2 years' work. Right now, I understand the government give 2 years' work for the agency work. So they jump ship and claim refugee. So when you claim refugee, they give you a work permit until your hearing you began. So the hearing, it takes years and years and years before they decided to keep them or to send them home. So my question is, have you ever anything to do with this kind of refugee claimant? Or have you know nothing about this? Right now, it gives Canadian government a lot of headache, I believe. But to me, the family that I have been as a translator, I feel very sorry for them. You know, if I am the person who decided, I will sign up, here you stay. So make it easy and non-complicated. So right now, they have a very long list of these things. The people from all over the world.
Well, thank you if I can speak for a minute, I think somewhat of what you're talking about is false refugee claimants and the determination system. And one of the things I think has to be careful of when we're talking about resettlement and private sponsorship, and the period of the Indochinese was really a period where Canada was not a country of first asylum. And so the only way people were getting to Canada, for the most part, was through resettlement, which is why Canada, Australia, and the United States have always been leaders in resettlement. At the time we're in now, resettlement is absolutely a crucial component and complementary component to asylum, but asylum is a very different system where we do have an actual legal obligation of not to send people back who are refugees, and that determination is a tough determination to make when they're already on Canadian soil, and I think the government really does struggle with ensuring that there is a program that is fair to true asylum seekers without encouraging false asylum seekers, false refugee claimants from coming. And so it's a fine balance. And the one thing that agonizes me at times is that this program of asylum and resettlement are meant to be true complements to each other. And the messaging that we see from the government too often these days is one that it's pulling those two programs apart and against. And you see these dialogue and rhetoric of bogus refugees, of queue jumpers. And I think we all, anyone who cares about refugees and advocates for them, must be strong and firm in their commitment that there is no queue, there is no line. You have a legal right to asylum if you come to Canada and claim asylum and are a refugee. And if we are voluntarily bringing you over by resettlement, then that is another welcoming means of coming here, and that the two programs work to ensure the broadest reach we can do in protection as a whole. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
That's what it's, the way I remember my wife was talking about when she went for the woman conference, a Christian woman conference. My wife is very much involved or pray for those who are in need of prayer. So one lady came, asked her to pray for her, and she asked her, what do you want me to pray for you? And she said, pray for me so I can be wise to make a decision. She happened to be one of the judge for those refugee claimants. And my wife said, so what do you do to them? So I just send them home, and that's it, because they own faith. So in this case, you know, I feel very humanist, you know, as human being, the law, it has to be the law. The rule has to be the rule. So I don't blame the government of doing this, but when you look at the reality of some refugee claimant here, it may be fake, but it may be real. So as the organization that dealing with this, I don't know if you are going to put this into the, you know, the thing that we are studying or in the future to look at this as this organization were doing. That's all I question. I don't recommend that you do anything about it. We have no power to do that. Okay, thank you very much.
I have one final comment when you were asking about the context, and I ask that a lot. We have 2 grandchildren, and for those of you who probably are in the same situation, I find it focuses your thinking to the future very greatly. So 2 comments. One specifically about refugees. I have been very surprised and discouraged the degree to which there's suspicion around refugees. I would say in the past, when you said you had had a refugee experience, there was a level of compassion, probably an interest in your story. I would say I'm as likely to meet with, if I say I've met somebody who's a refugee, oh, are they real? Or a level of suspicion. The second is, I think that in this country, since 9/11, and one of the panelists talked about it today, people talked about a real fear of people who are Muslim. I think that we really have to find very creative ways to mend that divide. We need, just as we had years ago, early Christian, Jewish dialogue, we need to find ways where, in fact, we talk about the fact that there's very direct fear and prejudice about people who are Muslim. I love the MCC program that has been engaged in an exchange of people and building friendships and having that dialogue. But that I don't know the answer to how, but I do think that that's very significant if we're going to address the situation in Syria. At a much broader level, having spent about a decade of my life living and working in Africa, first Southern Africa, later West Africa, who we are as Canada in the world, you know, if you think about the saying, think globally and act locally, we also have to be acting much better globally. Our foreign policy, the type of aid that we give, how we work, is losing our reputation of the values that I think many of us who worked in this movement held up. So I do think we need to be pretty conscious and thinking strategically about, if we're not happy with our current government or the current regime, of how we are portrayed in this world, what's happening in terms of our civil society, then we do need to act.
Thank you, Helena. I'm going to leave John with the final comment.
We went overseas in 1963. The world has changed so much. Canada, in this interim, was seen as a peacemaker, or a peacekeeper at least, had a good reputation. We've slipped. We're now a military organization. We need to be strong for some reason, which is weakening us. We spent $30 million on a war which brought us nothing but a bunch of caskets. And we need to reshuffle our priorities nationally. We've got to get back to that peace idea. Without that, I don't think anything will happen, or not too much will happen. That's one part. The other part is, I don't think the NGOs need to be held to that concept. There's nothing to prevent us as NGOs to go in there and do the revolutionary peace stuff, which is quiet, which is forceful, which works, and which will receive a blessing for Canada if we put our efforts to it.
Thank you. And so with the idea of revolutionary peace stuff, I'd like you to join me in thanking this panel for their energy then and their continued energy now.